Hello everyone, today we talk about early artillery as the cycle provided us with this late medieval warfare topic. Admittedly on Schwerpunkt, since the very beginning we talked a lot about medieval artillery for some reason. I think may have to do with the imperfect sort of randomness of the technical means that, coadjuvate the cycle in divine mediation. In any case, we live in a fallen world. What do you expect to begin with? It may be not one of the single most popular topics. I sometimes also voice my relative lack of interest towards sort of more technological side of the story when we talk about the art of war. If anything, because of Clausewitz and inspiration, we're also in a phase of the channel which we're going to really explore much more strategy, also theory of the art of war, politics, leadership in large-scale military operations. And even though, of course, artillery is important within this context, and in certain cases, in fact, it's even more sort of demanding for pursuing these objectives, it is virtually, at least in Clausewitzian theory, to be given for granted, as we can historically do to an extent, that the more important the army, the sort of relatively more standard equipment, right, which essentially brings us also to another realization that we often observe, that in fact the bigger the engagement, the more balanced the odds, and so basically the greater the symmetry with the foe, right. Naturally, history is not just fought among tendentially symmetrical armies. There is no such thing like symmetry, right? Asymmetrical warfare is a misnomer because warfare is asymmetrical by definition, and that's why we really have to come back on military theory at some point. The Clausewitzian series must be continued, not even ended, because we covered 3/4 of the Funkriege. Some of you, especially subscribing in the last couple of years, probably don't even know what I'm talking about. But it's all there, uploaded, and we'll surely continue that. In any case, early artillery warfare is always important to as a topic to be repeated for the sake of balance, right? Of, as far as possible, objectively assessing the extent of the artillery phenomenon. At some point we'll have to talk about the prehistory of this, because as you know, and we have already seen on Schwerpunkt, it's not just about what we're going to discuss now. Of course, the presence of fully fledged artillery, regardless of the relative, unsigned, it's the prelinear, essentially, nature of the descriptions, and so the impossibility also to verify, mostly from documentary rather than archaeological sources, most of the time, in fact. The nature of this early artillery may have been, in fact, something relatively small, but you shouldn't, in fact, we don't even know, right? Is that there was, of course, some affirmation stage, some experimentation phase of these guns that for having them essentially in the 20s of the 14th century available to an important degree, essentially industrial one by medieval standards, and that eventually we can start to find pretty much everywhere. In fact, even though predictably guns start appearing first in documentation in the most advanced countries that will also maintain actually the upper hand on that on the technological edge in the development of artillery. We know that this technology was present everywhere, that even in the most remote fringes of Europe, from the documentation that arrives slightly later, we know that it's not much, in fact, a matter of time, a matter of quantity that matters. How structured was the spread of guns in this early period? What were the capabilities of the local states to equip themselves with a substantial amount? Right. So the point is, technology is always there. even in the poorest places, even the Celtic French. We've seen it in the video about the late medieval Scottish organization. Every Highlander lord on the western Scottish seaboard had a gun for his, not so structurally stable castle out there. We know that well also from later warfare that, for example, we talk about the Scottish Highlanders, we talk about the Galloglags and so on. Even though these guys at home fought essentially as they would do during the migration era, or almost, their capacity, and they had in fact locally a few modern tools, so to say. When they went abroad fighting, they could use every weapon, including in fact the most technologically updated, advanced ones, perfectly well. Because, of course, not just locally, there actually was some of that, but the professional nature of the late medieval military elite makes also Europe very much sort of interconnected. Like there is a broader awareness of what war is about. There's just one way to make it, essentially, and guns obviously are there. They gradually develop. But everybody knows how they work. After all, the technology itself is pretty Spartan, it's pretty primitive. Now, the earliest written evidence for the canon is found in the ordinances of Florence for 1326. This is very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, we can imagine, again, that, as we'll see here now, since this was an order for the appointment of superintendents for the manufacture of a brass cannon, as well as arrows and iron balls for it, we understand that, again, these guns were around from quite a while, right? Some historians say, well, we could think that maybe they were there since 1320. It's likely that they were there from even the 13th century, if we have to be honest about the whole thing. We don't have, at least I don't think, research, because this by the way, the document of Florence is quite famous, but I'm sure that if we were to dig in the entirety of the medieval European archives, we would have some mention, maybe from the same Florence again, but from previous years as well, something that can be called a canon. Here, also the terminology can be equivocated. We don't know whether this was some kind of actual artillery, or maybe it was something smaller. As we've explained also in other videos, it doesn't even make sense to try to categorize the thing. It's just like for crossbows, there were giant ones, there were like artillery, other hand ones that were also very similar in construction, regardless of the sort of sophistication at the extremes of this scale that would naturally make it more better used for particular context. Consider that was lots of siege warfare, so even let's say the notion, for example, having a weapon that you have to wield in open field is something you surely can put to use also on defending your walls, right? But it's obvious that on the latter you can establish some, for example, heavier missile weapons that are going to maybe be more suited for just more positional warfare, etc. The other aspect here is interesting. Florence was just defeated by the Lucchese at the Battle of Alto Pascio the year before. There is a need to basically reinforce local garrisons, fortifications, because Castruccio had been launching pretty large raids into probably up to the gates of Florence. So there is this sense of withdrawal, of enclosing, of fortification, which is typical this decades before the big crack of the mid-14th century. All over the world, already a shrinking, already a more defensivistic mentality, naturally just by degrees, not like they had stopped going out there in the open. That's not a strategical thing, or a historical one to begin with. In any case, again, we are aware of in fact, the use of guns, according to later chronicles that, however, were reporting for the use in even a previous year than 1326. In fact, the sources speak of guns used by the Germans at the siege of Metz, where in 1324. We know that the Grenadines, this is also a later source to the say 1326, by the way, speak for guns at the siege of Basel in 1325. So it's obvious that there was something going on in this mid-20s for which artillery was starting to spawn more clearly out there. Again, I will not enter today in the proto-history or the prehistory of these guns. I'm going likely to make a proper video about this, and I'm specifically talking Europe, because we know that likely guns were used in the East earlier at some point, but we're talking China mostly, and in general, we know also that Europe would eventually make the greater use of this kind of technology for different reasons. Not that the Chinese had just the notion that they would use that just for fireworks because they were more peaceful than Europeans. That's nothing. That complete BS. They use it for military purposes mostly. Just they had more incendiary rather than explosive devices. Other references to artillery allegedly dating to the very beginning of the 14th century, even to the 13th, are also to be found. And that's where we think that may have been possibly right, if it wasn't for the fact that they all appear to be later interpolations. I honestly don't know what are the most recently updated achievements of historiography on the topic, but it's also likely that the status quo hasn't changed really too much. After all, we don't have any clear sources describing the spread of these weapons, just like no other weapon, telling the truth. At most, we get to know them when they were started being used in a consistent fashion. So there are different, I don't know, today's technology is way more complex and systemic and sort of large scale and sort of complex. We can't think exactly the same timings for some major sort of edge cutting technology, etc., having existed even relatively early on. But it's obvious that, especially in a pre-industrial society, with the general levels of technological development, things would have been much slower. It's not like a guy arrived, I don't know, in 1300 and said, "Look, guys, I found this thing. It explodes. Let's immediately try it for artillery." This stuff would have existed from quite a while. And we have reason to believe, for example, as we've seen in the video about the so-called sea fire, the liquid fire of the business, so-called Greek fire. There are different terminologies that this may have entailed also some earlier forms of, maybe explosive and even proper artillery devices being experimented here and there. The applicability is another story, but in order to project this dynamics on, in fact, a basis that we can't solidly document, we should make at least a great effort, like in broader scientific and economical terms, if anything only, but also in the broader picture, to try to imagine what is concretely more plausible in terms of the actual timing of this artillery. What actually matters, however, is how it spread. Because again, who cares whether they actually knew this stuff existed beforehand? It's more important to see how this starts manifesting and how it at that point really would answer specific questions posed by the art of war of the era, including the fact that, for example, castles had become way more important. There was, as we were saying before, a greater and formidable, structures. There's a moment of further encapsulation. So it's never like the technology simply came around. Again, I personally think that this may have been there. And what does it mean? Explosive? Explosives were known from a very, 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 very long time before, for sure. Right? But the applicability and the way to invest in this, in having just this is a bit like the later, I don't know, industrial revolution. It's not like the concept of steam engine did not exist thousands of years before, but there is just a point at which there is enough resources and distributed in a particular way that allows in a particular time in the history of warfare for this specific technology to start being applied and tested for achieving a particular purpose. So it's not like a random thing. Probably the spread of early artillery responded to very specific needs in that time in history. Again, technology doesn't quite change tactics. It's mostly the other way around. You can't do by a 10%. It's the entire doctrine that fundamentally requires something of that kind. Naturally, artillery was more performing in line of principle. At least it had eventually greater potential on the longer run than the more traditional artillery. That would remain, however, primary still for a couple of generations, essentially, before being surpassed by firing. Well, a very early video of mine dealt exactly with this, with the fact that older types of artillery still in use, etc., especially smaller ones. I can say counterintuitively because it may seem counterintuitive, but it's actually obvious. Like at that point, it's much more convenient to deploy a ballista at some point in a trebuchet if so many cannons are around, right? In specific niches of warfare, at that point, the more expensive piece has been surpassed, so there is no point of even lingering on that, right? But we'll talk about this aspect too. Naturally, for a couple of centuries, the two types of artillery remain operating together without too much of an issue, because as we explained also in other videos about medieval artillery, just like ancient artillery, etc., the destructive power was pretty limited. This is notorious, but in this sense, the way sieges were waged mostly entailed a sum of many pieces shooting together, and also using just as a support fundamentally for the most important strategic forces, namely the knights, the commoner. I mean the actual troops launching the assaults to the fortification, defending from these, etc. It's also notorious that the earliest reference to the use of cannon by the English dates to 1327. So we see exactly the same years, right? In which it's a year in which our earliest surviving picture of a cannon was also drawn, the Millimate manuscript executed that year by the same chaplain of Edward III, right, containing a picture of a terrestrial-mounted vase-shaped gun discharging a heavy feather bolt against a castle gate. So this is a very notorious image. I inserted also here, and it is truly, at least, again, probably if we searched for in archives a bit better, we would find something not necessarily more eloquent, but at least some, because it's not like things are specifically hidden, right? But traces, hints, etc. They're surely there. I'm sure there is surely a historiographical branch that deals in particular with this, even though probably something changing hasn't. The entire picture has, or by significant, for example, chronological distance or better sources, etc., has not come around likely. This feather bolt, interestingly enough, so with the wings in order to add stability, etc., aligns with the bolts that we were talking about for Florence. So it seems that was the earlier intuition, some sort of arrow shooter, right? Which suggests that, at least for this significant use of artillery, represented like this, documentable, and of a certain size, here evidently a proper artillery, not some handgun, was really being tested just at that point in actual combat, was spreading in the armies from a position that was not merely, some crazy alchemists trying to make strange machines work. Rather, like, that's the best we can think of. Like, we can apply this stuff right now, and gradually things immediately smoothing towards something more functional, more aerodynamic, etc. We've seen also bolts being there, cannonballs. The shape of the gun in the Millimade manuscript explains graphically also why early cannon were called vasi, that is pots, by the Italians, and in fact pot de fer by the French. Simply because pot makers were the only ones at the time having the technology in order to create this barrel with a perfectly or so circular section, right? So what would be used to make the cannon, except here it's literally just a base that is used also to stuff the bottom with more explosive and trying to concentrate to choke better, like in fact towards the mouth, as in a barrel, the bolt or other projectiles that were inserted there, fixed there, to receive all the push from the explosion below. The couple of guns used by the English at the Battle of Crécy, a couple of decades later, may have still been of this type, even though it's likely that the so-called bombard, right, that, as we'll see now, was essentially the most widespread name for early artillery, and artillery proper, suggests already a greater refinement and a kind of obvious consideration. I mean, the pot thing may have been even a temporary adaptation, some kind of divertissement small. But it doesn't take really... Everybody knew that the most effective way was just to have this tube, basically. Other names in use for artillery in this early date are already among the many, by the way, if we can, of course, specify them, because very often they would have been computed together with all the rest of artillery, including non-gunpowder one. Cannon, we know it from 1326. Gun also in practice in various forms. This is really fascinating, and the bombard in particular was derived from bombus, meaning loud humming noise. So it's an onomatopoeic derivation. That's also another part of the ambiguity when, if you're versed in sort of primary sources, medieval warfare, you know that when sieges come around, the most straightforward interest of the authors is not telling you what kind of types of weapons actually were there, but if anything, how many, right? There is a generic sense there was a lot of machinery, siege engines, however they called them. They didn't care essentially about the technology, unless it was something bigger, like, I don't know, even trebuchets at some point, where there were also smaller types, but the bigger ones were, if anything, the ones that stood out the most, and were even nicknamed for us to know also that there was something grandiose about that. Nevertheless, the smaller ones would have nobody would have cared about that. And so, given the limits in, say, artillery making, like as a structure, were limited, it's likely, as we were saying before, that among all those that machinery, there was also some early gun that we're simply not told about because it seemed not so impressive after all. Froissart, I made a video about the most famous French chronicler, even though he was Flemish, and especially during this context of the mid part of the 100 Years' War, because naturally a lot of good, not just historical documentation, but historiographical attention has been mostly projected towards England and France during this sort of centuries-old conflict. Speaks of bombards as well as cannon. in his description, for example, of the siege of Quesnoy. We are in 1340. The word bombard doesn't actually occur, however, in contemporary documents until several years later. So we are basically by the time of the Black Death kicks in, which is yet again more interesting because, as we just observed before, there is surely a connection between the spread, at least factorially speaking, among the various causes, in an important structural systemic sense, of early artillery due to a shrinking of medieval civilization, a greater need for fortification, for technological solutions, also in front of the crisis. Sure, this was connected paradoxically with also the economic crisis. If you look, for example, we talked about this also in the video about, again, the Greek fire, so-called Greek fire, that it's rather in times of crisis like late antiquity, the migration era, that technological innovation, regardless of the overall sort of effectiveness of military performance, actually is incentivated, because the notion is we have less resources now, we have to sort out a less, at least a more effective, a more cost-effective, beneficial way to employ them, right? Also, late medieval European society is essentially an increasingly elite one, right? Very far from being, in fact, a tripudium of and the people, republics or whatever. It's a moment in which the entire system radically and rigidly stratifies, which is probably the moment in which the ancien regime, as we know it in the later eras of the bourgeois revolutions, is affirmed, right? By the way, we see this paradox that, in fact, this technology is not going to save many, right? Probably the best examples are the Flemish ones, because the Flemish, as you know, in this time in the medieval warfare, had an exploit in terms of infantry capacity. Think about the Battle of the Golden Spurs. I mean, that is about these topics. And however, they were, given that they were just third estate government, they didn't have a fully fledged stattal system or a sort of broader, higher professional military organization, whatever. They stuck to that, and in fact, they got beaten throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages, by the way, by the feudal knights of France, of Valois, Burgundy. And the only thing that they changed in the military, keeping, to get defeated in the process, was in fact, almost disproportionate amount of artillery availability. Because these towns, regardless of the crisis, were still, however, rich. They had their artisans. Naturally, the city is the place where most guns are produced, traded, and so on. And this firepower is practically useless, right? At least the more military advanced countries out there, like France, like Italy, etc., of course, integrate these guns much better into more complete armies, right? As we've seen, Florence also presents this early proclivity to use of these guns, and they had pretty solid armies on their own. They would also, the Italians at least, would have this precocious spread of handguns in pretty consistent times, like 1/3 of the infantry by the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century. Admittedly, also because they had not a great inclination to general heavy infantry at that point, participation to politics. They preferred, they had also a pretty good one, but in contained numbers compared to before, and to what, especially from the mid 15th century, the Swiss and other sort of pike squares, nationally subsidized forces would actually provide, right? Italians were, too rich. They demilitarized in a sense across the population, and especially as city-states, they didn't have that enormous land. They were quite populous in terms of endemic concentration, but they didn't have, their population was often very much specialized, invested in other crafts. They wouldn't mobilize large resources like, I don't know, the Swiss or other, like the Spanish would have, to just getting them into the military. We will talk more about this aspect because there are interesting legacies also from these places. In any case, When we arrive at the mid 14th century, we realize that the earlier vase-shaped guns had disappeared for good, which was also predictable, which was thus something relatively fast, right, to appreciate. And we realize, of course, that guns per se, in a fully integrable military sense, had, of course, not fully spread up to this point. So what I said before, yes, guns existed for quite a while, but relevant to make a difference, a perceivable difference on the field? No. All right. The bombard as well as cannon, to some extent, were used as general terms for gunpowder artillery in general. Right? Cannon even more, like the bombard will be a bit more specific. Nevertheless, the latter two, for a while, were given the most straightforward, forwardly expandable structure, technology entailed by this type of gun, were dominating, right? In fact, just like crossbows, I was saying before, it's not like there was much gunpowder artillery differentiation. If anything, size was the greatest. I mean, we know the heavy grosse bombarde, but also the hand bombards. And this is, again, obvious, right? It's just a tube. It can be bigger or smaller, and there isn't much other differentiation. We're not aware, in fact, of this in this era specific variations in these terms. As I said at the beginning of the video, I made multiple videos explaining, for example, 15th century gunpowder artillery types as they were starting to differentiate. And surely something protoformically speaking would have already occurred at this point. But the most straightforward type of gun would remain the bombard for quite a while. Not until the late 14th century was the word bombard accepted as denoting only a heavy gun, the first true heavy bombard weighing something like 2,000 pounds, which appeared in only in 1362, so it's not even that late, actually. The earliest reference to guns being used in the field, as opposing to being used in sieges by both defenders and attackers, that was always symmetrical, right? These guns are, again, everywhere. There is nothing specific about their employment, unless we're talking size and how they were adapted to the circumstances, but the nature of these guns made them, in fact, expendable everywhere. Dates to 1339. Some people say it's Crécy. Not really. We have account books of the Flemish city of Brugge, Bruges, recording a new type of light artillery called the ribaud de camp, or ribaud. This will, in fact, develop historically into, smaller, almost, think about those organon guns, portable. I made a couple videos. One was about the Battle of Molinella, where at least some sources claim that they had been used for the first time. And we know it wasn't the case, also because in that specific case, both, the group of chronicles, both the group of chronicles for this or that side of the factions involved in the battle claimed that the commander, either the Montefeltro or Corleone, had used that portable gun for the first time. If anything, that was for mobile artillery in the field. But this would have also been adapted in a way or another. You understand that it doesn't take literally anything to conceive mobile artillery. The point is how or why would you need to have that? It's interesting, in fact, that artillery began to spread also in a moment in which probably the battle arrays were changing due to the crisis. These guns appear in a moment in which there was still the 3 lines in depth, tens of thousands of men, large armies. Then we arrived to in fact, the end of the 14th century with basically single lines, if anything, with divisional separated, the divisional repartition on the flanks, right, with a single battle line. And so something that had to do with the less impact sort of head-on cavalry funneling into a central channel protected by wings, and smaller armies. Telling the truth, there isn't even much a decline of cavalry more than much. I explained these things in our videos properly about late medieval art of war. Rather, the fact that armies being tendentially smaller than the previous period, because that's also the notion, the actual deal, until the mid 15th century. But even beyond, don't think that Renaissance armies were that bigger than early 14th century ones, right? Pre-crisis. I made a video specifically explaining this. We're more about peppering each other position, being more anchored to the terrain, and naturally, the smaller the army, the more important it becomes. And so at that point, you need to have these guns that do back and forth, hence the wheeled cart, right? We were basically told about this ribaud de camp or ribaud that, again, essentially evolves in this type of portable artillery we're discussing, naturally wheeled at some point. In fact, Froissart famously describes 3 or 4 guns bound together under this name. We know from other sources that it took the form of a row of small gun barrels mounted on a 2 or 4 wheeled cart, which Froissart himself likens to a medieval wheelbarrow. It's kind of obvious. You have literally like some sort of cart, because how do you push stuff? You put multiple guns on it, which makes them relatively expandable and available. Also because the smaller the guns, in this sense, the more exposed to the enemy they were. I mean, what's the point, right? If they're smaller, they have less reach. So these are the ones that, as we've seen, pepper the enemy lines. Or this could be used, of course, also in sieges, but tendentially it's not like, a great bomber that you can place hundreds of meters away from the fortifications and simply shooting at them at a distance, right? Hence also the need to have more readily available firepower at close range with these multiple guns that were not meant to necessarily fire all at the same time, nor to have that sort of, what would be the platoon fire later on effect. They would actually head pretty quickly and logically toward that direction. But the most important aspect of this was having the gun readily available to fire in different circumstances. This would brought to the development also a fixed mantlet, close range, to protect the gunners that were, as we've seen, more directly exposed. These were precious individuals that had some technical skills and general knowledge of how these guns were to be operated. You didn't want to waste. They were crewmen. You didn't want to throw into the fray just per se. And this type of mobile artillery would be called a char de guerre, cart of war, which is not necessarily field artillery in the sense that it was conceived initially to simply used in open field. Right, this would be used also in siege warfare because you could gain some level of surprise at a point if you had a major bombard, even hidden behind a major screen, a major mantlet. The enemy would kind of know, right? Instead, moving this thing around the enemy fortification, etc., could provide with some kind of surprise. The barrels could usually be fired either all together or else in rapid succession, as we explained. We know of 3 monstrous Italian contraptions of 1387, each having as many as 144 individual barrels in 3 48-barrel tiers, which could be fired in groups of 12. This is quite interesting. It's basically the same concept of a machine gun. In fact, as we explained in the video about the machine gun and at the beginning, already from the 16th century we have guns that are capable of firing in rapid succession. That's a different thing, obviously, also not just from this previous one, but also from the later mechanism. But conceptually it's there, right? It's the idea of moving this 144 barrels all loaded at short range and say, place them in front of a gate, place them in front of a defensible place. You're going to hurt a lot. Right, you have, of course, to come relatively close to the enemy, but it's going to be something. And evidently, this is a developed enough gun. By the way, we're as early as 1387, right? So again, they're just the person that, I mean, not the person, but a person that had maybe 20 years of age in 1326 could have still been alive to see this 1387 achievement, right? If they had been lucky to escape the plague. But again, the region, the country is the same, and it obviously shows some purpose. Probably the rebat de camp, as it was also better known in French from later terminological convention, was initially developed for the defense of narrow spaces in castles, as we just pointed out, such as gateways, passages, and breaches. Naturally, its potential as a source of mobile firepower in the field must soon have been recognized, and within a short while was to be found to using relatively great numbers, particularly in the Low Countries that, as we explained before, if anything, had a lot of these guns, but they didn't know how to do too much with them. At least they would turn out to be more useful for the artillery park of the Dukes of Burgundy, that in fact in this surpassed even what would become the greatest artillery park in the later Middle Ages, at the threshold of the Renaissance, that is the French one. All right. So again, these guns are a bit like all technologies, some sort of sophistication initially when we see this, especially these more refined types. Some can be exceptions. Again, here also we call them a rebat de camp because mostly in the English-speaking world we have come to ally. At least had some standards have been set by which we, outside of it, come to align just for the sake of convention, of effective communication. But everywhere in Europe, this stuff was being experimented. And tendentially, in fact, as we said at the beginning, there was a pretty unitary European development. Military-wise, at this point, even in arms and armor, basically, at least Western Europe looks the same. Doesn't really take erratic directions or back and forth. Everything develops, updates at very short time, pretty much everywhere in the same way. In 1382, the rebels of Ghent, so we're again in Flanders, before Brugge, had as many as 200 chars de guerre, from the French Chronicle, which are described as high-wheeled with long forward projecting iron pikes for defense. This is quite fascinating because they are apparently more elevated, and they somehow, for this reason, being bigger and likely less wieldy, they would have easily been targeted by cavalry. And in fact, later on, the mitraille would be the most persuasive mean to defend artillery, at least frontally, from especially cavalry, but also infantry. But in this time where, again, cavalry was especially important, and in general, like this Flemish, mostly fighting on foot against feudal armies, at least in this case, it's fighting against also other Flemish, but still with that pinch of feudal capacity. Well, if you have a line of these and you have some iron pikes in front of it, you're going to essentially create some sort of a fortification. Cavalry is not simply going to impale itself against that. And again, it's not going to do practically anything in the bigger strategic picture, but at least in the moment it can be a mean to an end. Besides, you can always defend the guns with infantry. For example, you can place the guns as carts, as as the Hussites were doing, with some kind of fortification even. Consider that Flanders is a place that has a lot of material wealth, even after the crisis, so they could spend in that direction. As we've seen, this will not even pay off, militarily speaking, more than much. Apparently, there was also a lot of these guns, in fact, at the Battle of Rosebecke, that witnesses the collapse, probably, of the Flemish military model under essentially the feudal warfare of the Dukes of Burgundy, that themselves in 1411 while blockading Paris with their army, were said to have been accompanied by 2,000 such carts, either an exaggeration for 200 or perhaps a reference to the number of barrels, even though it's likely that it's a simple exaggeration. Naturally, the Dukes of Burgundy were pretty powerful. The states of the Valois Burgundy were, as you know, one of the most advanced states at the time. Especially, they had all these Flemish towns that had been gradually subjugating, providing large amounts of this stuff. And so the feudal army of Burgundy would tendentially be accompanied also by a lot of artillery. Overloading yourself with artillery is not so important, but of course, if you're marching against such a big city, a metropolis of the time, such as Paris, well, that can be useful. There is all a specific change, like in the way of war in this generation, that is not so pronounced as I often say. Like it's not like cavalry particularly declines, especially for as the most important arm, right? In more conventional sense, there's just less opportunities for it to be so decisive. But it's still, after the Black Death crisis, the actual upper arm, right? As it's also shown in these contexts. You can look at exceptions. There are, especially the English, are basically the only exception of all the army. It means the foot fighting, at least armies of already victorious in the early 14th century that continue to do that. After the mid-14th century, they had basically stopped, unless on particularly broken terrain with a Swiss, something like that. It's more like ambushes than, say, proper open field clashes. You have really to await the mid-15th century before cavalry was, significantly crippled for especially Renaissance infantry to be more relevant. And still, however, under the command of those who essentially fought on horseback, not as strengthening of the people, quite actually the contrary in practice. The Ribat de Caen, however, does not, as you can predict, a long life, right? It would, if anything, remain an accompanying weapon next to ever more courageous armies and bigger guns, as a matter of fact. There is also another important tactical quantity that we already anticipated here, that is that the widespread introduction of the handgun, which at that point was overall much more effective than any artillery. Like at that point, again, it's like having, crossbowmen. Crossbowmen versus bombards. Crossbowmen win. They're men. They can aggress this place, etc. If we assume this were to fight separated. Besides, again, handgunners at large are, in fact, many. They're mobile. They are ever better equipped. So there is properly a philosophy of war for developing, surpassing in performance the crossbow, the longbow. This is something we notice. These weapons as well will remain, together also with composite bows, etc., quite around for quite a while, even in the West. At least the former two, up to the mid-16th century, would still be relatively effective. But, of course, by that point, the arquebus had taken mostly the place overall. The greater problem was, again, to have a steady supply and sort of production of these guns, or at least properly the money to order them, and then the same resources to train the handgunners to operate in a disciplined fashion as possible. Naturally, we are relatively distant from more organized, alternating lines of fire tactics. Gunners were surely more scattered at the beginning, and again, especially in smaller numbers, they had some sort of less collectively refined employment. However, also that logic was already ingrained. In fact, we know relatively few about how these tactics developed. In particular, due to the the relative novelty of the guns, again, with the dynamics which we just described. However, it's as if there were this positivistic technologistic bias whereby everybody's obsessed with when is the first time these guns were around so I can, use them in my war game or whatever. However, crucially, the most important thing is tactics, collective training. How did they use the stuff in practice on the battlefield? That's something which I think has never been properly studied yet, and that is also a bit difficult to reconstruct. It's paradoxically easier to reconstruct early 14th century tactics, even as far as crossbowmen, pavismen, etc. go, than in, say, the latter half of the 14th century. The word organ gun, appearing in place of the rebut de camp from the late 14th century onwards, bear witnesses to the continued survival of such weapons, but also the increase, as we've seen, for example, in the case of Italy, of in the number of barrels used in the same gun, right? And so the necessity of playing this organon in a more complex and thus also consequential way. Late 15th century pictures of guns captured in the Burgundian Wars included several of wheeled carriages mounting several small barrels. Right. However, there were usually three. Such multi-barreled varieties of light artillery should not be confused, however, with cannon mounting, or more rarely barrels, such as different figures, for example, from the 70s of the 15th century. Such guns are usually referred to in the sources as cannon having tests or pots, right? We also know movable breeches called chambers, which were secured in position in a gun by use of leather-covered wedges. Such chambers contained the charge used to fire the gun and were employed in many early hand to make things smoother. However, the escape of powder gas rendered this method of loading unsatisfactory, and it was not long before most guns tended to be purely muzzle loaders for just the sake of practicality and also avoiding accidents, which would still go on for a long while. There are some pretty big bombers, like the Mont Meg, for example, that were sometimes properly created in sections that could be screwed together. We've seen this also in the Dardanelles gun, made recently a video including that, but also a very early video on Schwerpunkt was dedicated to that. Yeah, to something around Mont Meg as well, that, as you know, is preserved at the Castle of Edinburgh. And sometimes these guns, by the way, were employed minimally, right? Just a few shots, maybe in their entire career. They were very prone to damage, but the best builds could also be expandable later times. In fact, the Dardanelles guns was essentially seized by the British later on, if I'm not wrong, in Victorian times, when it was still essentially guarding the Dardanelles, the Straits. So it's between Asia and Europe, because the sheer size could project this, let's say, these guns reach pretty far. Also, to realize that it's not like artillery technology changed too much, right? After all, even today, like what was obtained by performance in the early 20th century is basically most of we still have today, just adapted for different tasks and purposes. Filka sniper rifles, something like that. Now, movable breeches continued, however, to be still used, in particular for rebut de camp, because they were smaller. If anything, the gun was small. And the same goes, in fact, for other smaller guns as a consequence. The earliest guns were made of brass or copper and were fairly small, weighing only 8 to 18, 20 kilos themselves, and firing missiles of only a few pound weight. Actually, brass or copper were more expensive than later iron. Of course, there would be improvements in metallurgy that, in fact, mostly revolve around the quality of iron that, however, would remain lower in kind. Bronze cannons were better. Generally, they were more elastic. They withstood better the enormous stress of the explosion, etc. However, as artillery increased in spread in sizes, and so the cost began higher for material, there was a cost-benefit ratio balance where, by effect, iron would become more preferential. Some early guns were even made of wood that we know of, with only a core of metal. If you think about it, it sort of makes sense, at least for the smaller ones. Petrarch, for example, refers to a wooden cannon in 1343. However, in the latter decades of the 14th century, although many guns were made of latten, wrought iron guns were already by far the most common, becoming bigger and bigger as time went by, also thanks to that, because they had to, again, in that sense, like the iron availability was not much of a problem, much more, but in the sense the need for firepower was greater. The problem of artillery wasn't much, nor the gun or the projectiles. Those could relatively easily found, just like it had happened for the older types of artillery. The problem now was and the projectiles, of course, were more difficult to find, at least to construct at this point, and to properly, like in the past, they could have been cut, shaped better, but even a rock would do, right? So, but by far, it was black powder to be the most expensive, the one that required the greatest resources to be provided. These iron guns were made from longitudinal strips of iron welded together, with iron hoops driven over them from end to end. The stands or beds on which they were mounted were called tillers, or in England by the late 14th century, trunks, the guns being secured to them by means of leather thongs, ropes, strong wire, or iron bands. We have evidence of an order for a tiller to be made at Caen, Normandy, 1375. This is described as a large bulk of helm to be deeply grooved for the cannon to lie in, another for the side pieces in front for pointing the piece, and various other bolts and timbers for side pieces at the back. Lower beams and assorted unidentifiable parts, because of course, in order to properly position the cannon, orient it, and reuse it also in the same place, it had to be fixed. You had to have a structure frame that absorbed the recoil adequately, could be in part reused. So again, it's not much the gun per se, it's all what you have to use in order to properly operate it that will consume the largest resources, but primarily among the many, it's gunpowder. One chronicle states that the aforementioned tillers did not last very long in action, that basically after a few days they needed to be changed. We have the earliest references of wheeled gun carriages date to the 14th century, associated with the rebat de camp that we mentioned before. This, again, can be, depending on, doesn't say anything about the size, for example, or how frequently this mobile artillery was actually used in combat, like in different areas of Europe as opposed to others. Honestly, again, I'm not particularly informed about the various. I don't think there is any study to begin with that really looked at the picture in comparative terms across Europe, right? But you can imagine that wherever warfare was more, say, the art of war was more advanced, the guns had the most sort of intense type of employment. Could be different. There is some power that invest more in the bigger artillery park, others that specialize in smaller ones. This is really normally typical of kingdoms versus city-states. But if you really look at the essence of the guns, even structurally, typologically, they're basically the same everywhere. They're used perhaps slightly in different quantities, degrees, but we're looking at the same type of warfare. Heavier guns and wheeled carriages made their appearance relatively early as well. For example, there's an Italian source mentioning two-wheeled gun carriages being used at the siege of Quero in 1376. They were, however, rare, very rare, until the 15th century. As far as at least the documentation goes. The notion is that they were mostly developed by the Hussites during the 20s and the 30s of the 15th century because of their wagon forts and all what we have actually debunked in general as this higher form of, technological development. Likely the French, the Italians used this, as well as other peoples, telling the truth, more sort of structurally and scientifically than others. Nevertheless, the availability of larger guns on wheel carts for action rather scarce. I mean, how would you, for example, create a cart that actually enabled the gun to be stable? One thing is transportation, one thing is use, and most of this artillery is static. It's basically going to remain so, also in open field for centuries. More than, say, artillery could be moved naturally on the battlefield, but most of the time it was just placed there where you had to shoot when this was not quite the time, would actually become more fully integrated artillery, was more of a fully fledged open field arm. But what was the point after all of shooting, especially the bigger pieces from their transportation? It doesn't make any sense. First of all, they had a greater strategic value. Tactical purpose mostly was about siege warfare, and the roll time took really a lot. Mostly it's siege warfare you want to employ this, and there wasn't much dynamism after all, especially the bigger the gun. Right, so that's the reason in practice. If anything, transporting it in certain circumstances in semi-fortified battlefield situations, etc., was important. However, remember that we're talking a contained amount of guns, right? Just having a few tens of larger types was a huge deal for sort of a field army of some regional force. Now, the next stage in the development of these frames was the elevating carriage, which was a means of depressing or elevating the barrel used prior to general introduction of trognon, which first appeared roughly the beginning of the 15th century. This properly mean to sort of depress or elevate would fully affirm itself in the second half of the 15th century. Made some videos already explaining this, but that shows, if anything, some greater sophistication, mostly stemming from siege warfare again, because that's where most artillery was molded in, say, doctrinal terms, you can say, in anachronistic terms. This frame is called, especially in Western historiography, the Burgundian type of carriage with tournon, because there is a famous amount of it preserved in the Swiss museums today as a consequence of the capture of many pieces of artillery by the Confederates during the Burgundian Wars. At that time, the Burgundian army was essentially, together with the division Condotta, the most advanced. And also in technological terms, to a degree, especially in terms of artillery power, and this, as we've seen, mostly Flemish artillery technology, adequately integrated by the Burgundians in their army. Things would go sort of wrong for them. The Swiss had a simpler and more effective mean that was not easier, right? Simpler and effective is, like the stupid knights could be butchered because if you actually use infantry now, well, no, the Swiss probably decided to radically invest a much larger amount of resources in the training of their infantry. It's not like infantry is a token you can use sometimes. Most people are completely unaware of the differences between, say, early 14th and second half of 15th century infantry. They think that infantry is just a thing that remains always the same, and that you just have to be smart to use. Otherwise, you end up like those dumb knights who depreciated the commoners, did not know how infantry worked. Yeah, exactly. Especially the knights did not know how infantry worked. They knew how infantry worked better than infantry men did, right? But that's also another story. We'll come back, however, on the Burgundian wars at some point. Made some videos about the Burgundian army, especially early on in Schwerpunkt, but that's one of those really evergreen topics for some reason. By the beginning of the 15th century, there were enough cannons around for division into different categories that we, again, described in different other videos. There is some English poetry describing bombards, guns, serpentines, fowlers, convoys, crapauds, carpados in French, culverins, and other sorts more than 8 or 9. So this was understood properly as a moment of subdivision, of sophistication, properly of artillery, specialization, functionalization. Bombards had retained the biggest size, at least they had been maintained at the bigger level because they were the simpler ways of making the gun, right? So naturally, the bigger the gun, the most difficult it was to make it, and so the simpler design had remained relatively unchanged. Some of these guns could pace over 4.5 tons, and they could fire missiles of a few hundred kilos in weight. The performance per se could be really impressive, but the costs, the upkeeping, the general expendability of this were at times prohibitive. Cities rivaled with one another for whom had the best gun, right? And Bordeaux, for example, in 1420 had a large bombard, apparently capable of firing a stone weighing roughly 350 kilos, and was making another that could fire stones of probably 200, 250. The second largest type of gun was the Fowler of Vogler in French. This also was apparently, at least it first appeared in Flanders at the very beginning of the 15th century. We can imagine, because normally northwestern Europe is the region that was historically most studied, especially within the Anglosphere, let's say. Also, the terminology, of course, is French dominated. But of course, if you look at Germany, if you look at Italy, if you look at Spain, there was something else going on, right? And this pretty much the same thing, the same terminology. The Vogler, the Fowler, right, could be up to almost 2.5 meters, and weights ranging from, say, 130 to several thousand kilos, right? So these were massive beasts, though they were typically on the lighter side of this range even. They were usually breech loading and occasionally mounted alongside rebats de camp themselves by at least the later period. The crapaud of Crapaudin was smaller, still measured something between 1.5 meters, 2.5 meters in length. Then you had culverins, serpentines being the smallest type. The barrels could be quite long relative to their caliber, hence the concept of serpent, because they were pretty long, right? From colubra, which is Latin type for a specific type of snake. So those also would, as you know, go on as particular types of guns. Charles the Bold had an almost 10,000 meters long serpentine, and 6 more measuring something between 2 and 3 meters and a half at the famous Siege of Neuss. That was a major display of firepower, and though it led nowhere, this is a bit typical, especially of Charles the Bold, 1474. To differentiate the artillery from the hand culverins that were also a thing, they were often called simply grand colouvrant. You have a night witness like the Lord of Saint-Remy that notes that the serpentines the French used at Azincourt in 1415 were of similar type, evidently also at this point in history without much success, especially in open field. Monstrelet describes a great number of wagons, carts, cannons, and ribot de camp present at Azincourt, again from the French side. I made a video about, if anything, the Battle of Formigny that was fought just a generation later, where you see that the French managed to dislodge the English. Not much with gunfire from their position, but still that advances on semi-fortified positions were naturally covered by artillery as well as defended by artillery. So we're looking at mostly a supportive role to cavalry, to infantry that, again, does not have to be understood as substitutive, right? There isn't such a thing like, oh, now there is artillery, so basically it's as if you had cavalry and infantry. No, the tone is pretty low still, and it will remain for a long time. Mortars emerged toward the end of the 14th century with the broader purpose of a more arced parabolic trajectory, especially to shoot inside besieged settlements, just bypassing the walls. The only problem that they had to be carried more closely to the places, at least the normal cannon. Initially short and heavy with wide bores, and they grew smaller over the 15th century, because in general also the metallurgical advancements rendered these pieces more effective, smaller. After all, with mortars, still, even with a modern weapon, is that there is a very specific precision. The shot works more because of gravity than particularly sort of straightforward trajectory. So there is even an increased level of precision. The English at Orléans in 1428 deployed 15 breech loading mortars in the siege train. This gives you a dimension of also how many could be used, even for the siege of such an important city and at such a delicate moment during the war. Early cannons fired either small iron balls or heavy quarrels, as we've seen, like the ones we've seen in Milemade's picture described by the Florentines in 1326. Such quarrels or garrots were used by, for example, Philip van Artevelde's guns at Rosebeck in 1382, still. As we've seen also in this case, not with great effect, but for saying that, again, compared to the older, more traditional type of artillery, after all, the sense that these guns were just some sort of bolt shooters at times, like they weren't necessarily only conceived for smashing, fortifications, etc., was there, right? This also shows that artillery had an anti-human function as well. It wasn't just about, at least in particular situations, it wasn't just about smashing fortifications. They typically featured oak shafts, iron heads, and flights of iron, steel, or brass. They could, so these quarrels were also pretty big, like just like a ballista's shot. Like they could be something between 7 and 14 kilos, or even more. Froissart, for example, mentions heavy quarrels reportedly up to almost a quintal, which is a bit exaggerated. This would have happened in Siege of Artres in 1377. But it depends what kind of targets it would have had to shot at this point. Obviously, it wasn't personnel. Just per se was more like a giant ram that had to smash like a pencil against some sort of cracker. And this, of course, design didn't have much of a future, but it's meaningful that fairly late in time, like the last decades of the 14th century, this was still a thing, and that an avenue had been opened for that kind of projectile. Quarrels remain, in fact, common throughout the entire 14th century. They were the primary artillery projectile even until apparently the early 40s of the 14th century still. Naturally, again, the bowl, the longer tube to channel it adequately, sort of in for ballistic needs, sort of took over. Also because these weapons were mostly themselves taking on mostly an anti-fortification character rather than some more precision fire that could be suggested by the quarrel, maybe for again destroying any armored men on the ramparts, right? They were still there in the 15th century. In fact, we know that Charles de Baul's Grand Coulevrant also fired quarrels. This is quite fascinating. We didn't know that until the late 16th century there were quarrels shot. There are many ways humans kill one another, also for some level of sadistical pleasure, just with, let's say, I don't know, a fully armored opponent being literally pierced through by one of these bolts would surely satisfy. And the point is, however, that there is always some logic behind the picture. Of course, as we just said, these quarrels were not majority, as we've seen. From the mid-14th century, you have the more irregular cannon bolts, basically, around. However, again, depending on how these pieces were shot, it could still cause significant damage, and therefore there would have been an assortment also of non-standardized types of guns that are not properly recorded that would be able, and would shoot, in fact, this types of projectiles. Lead pellets served the smallest guns, while iron cannonballs recorded in the 1326 Florentine account used at Crécy in 1346 gave way to stone shot as calibers grew in the latter half of the 14th century. This is also relevant because of the need to create, again, more functional artillery. So at the beginning, you could find the more elegant solutions, and you resort to stone, like traditional artillery had been about. Naturally, the future would, again, be cannonball, but these bolts could literally be stones. The earliest stone shot reference appears in the Chronicles of Pisa in 1364. We know that the French would soon use this as well. The Germans tell us in 1377 they did so. England saw gunstones and thus large guns only from the 80s, apparently. These things do not, again, mean too much, chronologically speaking, because, again, the way to use this was always there. What is fascinating here is to see that the more advanced countries are also the ones who expand more artillery, partially regressing with this technology. Again, the not regressing in the actual military sense, they're stepping up, right? But using, of course, less sophisticated means because they're actually more functional for a more concerted use of these weapons. All right, you can have the best technology ever, but it costs too much, right? So you have to adapt if you really want to be competitive out there. I have made videos about all these areas, about medieval Flanders, medieval Pisa, even the single city-states. So you know more or less the context, and you know how advanced they were as a whole. And there is a similarity also regarding the production, the preparation of these shots. For example, like the stones were per se, crafted by skilled, well-compensated stone masons. In the age of trebuchet warfare, you could have even unpolished trebuchet, even though some countries like England, for example, had a royal control for public expeditions with already sort of sculpted stones, especially spheric ones, to create the best projectile. With guns, of course, you have to do that forcibly. You also had at some point to coat the same stone in thin lead to minimize barrel wear, because you can't have a perfectly smooth surface of the shot, and this could actually damage the cannon further. As I've seen, these guns were pretty delicate. They tended to explode because of this internal deformation, etc., that at some point would destroy it. Think about Orban, the guy who gave the monster bombard to the Turks. He died by operating it at the same siege of Constantinople. And these shots could be very heavy, right? We're told even of 90 kilos by the late 14th century. In 1451, Philip the Good of Burgundy's accounts reference 3 gunstones weighing up to 400 kilos each. So we're really looking at monstrous forces, titanic ones that conciliate themselves with this general picture. The world is actually changing. There is, as you know, a lot of literature stressing the importance of, say, this passage toward modernity because of firearms. It's true and not true to a degree. It's the interesting. It's in art of war terms, the most interesting part is the general complexity of the context in which they were used. I mean, all what was required to sustain an artillery park, for example, wasn't even, as we've seen, technology. Technology simply came by itself. It adapted to the requests, not the other way around. The requests of an importantly changing time in history. So we will, if anything, observe more this change. I have a video, for example, probably on the germs of this transition, which are illustrative of also how the same people at the time believed that, which is not the usual rhetoric. Oh, okay, so a knight was destroyed by these things, which was also actually a case for the whole awareness, but there is more. There is more in the organization of warfare, but it gets down to politics. It's the type of ancien regimes, plural in this case, that had affirmed themselves in this context and what kind of troops they could put together. And again, I made videos pretty early on about medieval artillery. We're adding, and I realized this playlist is not very much watched, but because I understand that, as I said at the beginning, I'm not myself too much of a fan of artillery, but this technological topics, I like the topic of artillery. I find it fascinating, and everything is really fascinating, but I prefer something less material or technical per se. You must learn that as well, however, because you realize that also these weapons spread at an important rate, like say at an important speed, to change the entire picture. Again, there isn't a power that doesn't use these guns, or that doesn't make it work in just for the sake of survival, you see. And that's what, at the end of the day, we appreciate of this spread, that regardless of all the uncertainties, the why, the how, whatever, this stuff went on in a pretty uniform way to dominate still warfare and today, and it definitely found, and that's the historically and militarily speaking more important aspect, eventually a set of preconditions that are a bit, instead, the big elephant in the room, a room though without light, because we are not simply deflecting towards something that, say, is documented or documentable, or at least readily identifiable, and just sticking to the technological side of the story. Technological side of the story is easy because it's the one you can measure materially, right? But the reason why at that point in the 14th century artillery rose to become a fully fledged arm on the battlefield, not just during sieges, is something that you should explain on the basis of the context, on this fertile terrain it grafted on, that allowed for it to spread further, which is, again, something that didn't happen obviously by chance, nor in a way you can't quite dismiss in no, it's just, I don't know, technology wins. What without in which context, for which purpose? This is people doing it. It's not technology doing it, right? That's quite relevant and that's probably the most difficult thing to look at. That would sort of revitalize also properly the way we look at the art of war, because it seems today as if, I don't know, just the military say the military, the pop culture is obsessed, at least as far as medieval warfare is concerned, mostly with weapons. And what's the best weapon? What's the best armor? Concepts that do not find any place in any moral or scientific dimension of the art of war. But we still celebrate because of emotions, of aesthetics, nothing else, right? War is something completely different. It has nothing to do with anything you see in reenactment, in HEMA or whatever. And especially we have documented history of the actual ways this stuff worked, right? Ask a reenactor in the sense to appreciate artillery. I mean, even if nobody talks about artillery. Why? Because you want mostly to talk just about the knight, right? And shiny armor, which is perfectly fine. That's also what we do. But that doesn't consider either of the two in the actual context in which they were fighting, which is not the context of the single guy's perspective, Call of Duty, individualistic, subjectivistic, relativistic, emotionalistic, close-up image of the guys. It is actual, battle line scale, tactical capacity, intelligence, combat, moral forces in large formations that are not replicable in the way, especially in the Middle Ages, they were used, and they're not replicable unless you go to actual war, right? What matters in theory, trying to reconstruct this kind of combat is actually killing people. And obviously that's off the table. With the means of the time, by the way, in the context of the time, you can't even reconstruct, you can't even measure, right? And that's incredible, that how hard-headed some people who also happen to be the more followed, the ones to spread more information in general about the stuff in the Middle Ages, again, this pseudo-military culture, actually go by, and that they largely don't understand themselves. So it's, again, all very complicated, more complicated than it seems. And we wish we could sort of tell history in a more constructive way, but unfortunately, we end up always seemingly still beating the same dead horses, now by now skeleton or dust, and that just measures the level of complete strategic and cultural illiteracy that our world witnesses. Unfortunately, that's the situation. Very well, however, we will continue talking about medieval artillery at some point. Now, I hope for a while, considering the distribution. We'll talk more about battles and else, or even, again, context where artillery was used, but in a bit more less theoretical or descriptive technical fashion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.